You have just read about strategies for teaching to the brain, or using what we know about neuroscience to better structure our classroom and lessons. As you watch this video, keep the following questions in the back of your mind. What are learning cycles? How can I use learning cycles and chunking to better structure my lessons so students learn more? You've already learned a bit about how the brain stores information. Remember that it is possible to retain information in the short-term memory without actually learning it. For example, you can remember a phone number just long enough to dial it, and then forget that number as soon as it is no longer useful to you. Our goal as teachers is to make sure our students don't treat the information we're teaching them like a phone number. We want them to keep that information in their long-term memory. In other words, we want them to learn. Now, let's say that instead of just hearing a phone number once, we ask our students to repeat the number 50 times. Or we have them write that number down 50 times. Or maybe we ask them to take the phone number and turn it into a song or write a poem about it. This would make it a lot more likely that the information stays in their brains much longer. This is a strategy called rehearsal. Rehearsal involves repeating and reprocessing information over and over again so that it passes into long-term memory. There are two kinds of rehearsal: rote rehearsal and elaborative rehearsal. An example of rote rehearsal would be writing the phone number on the board 50 times. Rote rehearsal is best when students have to learn something exactly, word for word, or number for number in order. Simply understanding what a phone number is isn't enough. You need to know the exact numbers in the exact order for it to be useful. And the best way to do rote rehearsal is with simple repetition. Say what you want to learn out loud a lot. Listen to it over and over. Set the sound of the numbers to a song. One famous example of this is the Tommy Two-Tone song 8675309, where a man sings a woman's phone number over and over again so he won't forget it. And anyone who has heard the song has had a hard time forgetting it too. Elaborative rehearsal, meanwhile, is not just about memorizing information. It involves taking that information and doing something with it, tying it to other meanings, thinking critically about what we already know about a certain subject, and tying what we know together with this new information. For example, let's say you're trying to understand a particular poem. If you wanted to just memorize the poem word for word, then you would use rote memorization. But when you spend time trying to interpret the poem's meaning, suddenly the words become tied up with images or sounds. They take on meanings that you can see or hear because of past experiences that poem is now linked to in your mind. In this case, it's not so important that you memorize each word of the poem in specific order. Rather, you have learned the message that the author of the poem wanted you to learn. You know what the poem is about, even if you can't recite it. This is a strong example of elaborative rehearsal, and this kind of learning has a much higher chance of entering your long-term memory than simple rote rehearsal, because it's not just about forcing your brain to remember a series of words. Instead, you are remembering the meaning or lesson behind the words, and most times are attaching an emotion to it. Elaborative learning also requires more time for the brain to process ideas, so make sure that you structure your lessons accordingly. Don't jump from one subject immediately to the next. Give your students' brains time to absorb the information you have given them. Timing is, in fact, very important to helping students learn. Let's say you have 1 hour to teach students a lesson on multiplication. You want them to learn how to multiply by 2. 2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 3 is 6, and so on. Did you know that within the hour you have set aside to teach them, there are specific periods of time in which students are more likely to remember what they hear? In other words, we remember more at certain times than we do at others. This is called the Primacy Recency effect. And it tells us that when learning new material, students are better able to remember the first thing they learn, followed by the last thing they learn. Knowing this, you can organize your lessons to help your students remember the material better. During a 60-minute lesson, teach new material first, that is, in the first 20 minutes. This is called prime time number 1 because it is the best or prime time for students to absorb information. After that comes what's called a downtime. For the next 10 to 15 minutes, don't teach any new information because it will be more difficult for students to absorb. Instead, you want to reinforce what students have already learned. Have them practice it, or ask them to take that information and present it in a new way. For a lesson about multiplying by twos, that would be a good time to ask students to come to the chalkboard and work some multiplication problems, or to recite their multiplication tables out loud or in groups. You can teach them a song about multiplying by twos. The last 20 minutes of the class is called prime time number 2, or the closure, and it is important because it helps solidify the lesson in your students' minds. Review what you've learned in brief terms, and ask students to start thinking about the implications of the lesson. For a lesson on multiplication, ask students to think about how often counting by twos is useful in daily life. This will help them start making sense of the information. In other words, the first half of the lesson is devoted to rote rehearsal. During this last part, you're giving students an opportunity for elaborative rehearsal. You already learned that when students try to learn, information passes through the working memory before being passed on to long-term memory, and that one major limitation to learning is the fact that working memory is pretty limited. Like a cup, it can only hold so much at one time. When you're trying to learn too much, the brain's automatic filters turn on and new information just doesn't get in. One way to get past the limitations to working memory is through a process called chunking. That is, instead of asking your brain to learn a lot of little facts, take those facts and put them into a group. Make it clear that these little pieces of information are all parts of a whole. Your brain can take on a few big chunks of information much easier than it can hold on to a lot of little facts. For example, let's say your students are learning Spanish, and you want them to learn some new vocabulary. You could give them a list of words like cat, airplane, love, give, pillow. Or you could give them a list of words that are all about a certain subject. Dog, cat, bird, iguana. These are all animals. They are all nouns. Instead of having to work with a random mix of nouns, verbs, and concepts that don't have a lot to do with each other, give a student a list of words that are all connected to one another. They are all parts of a whole. And it will be much easier for your students to learn these chunks of information than a lot of disconnected words. Let's review. In this lesson, you learned a few strategies for teaching to the brain. You learned that retaining information is different from learning it. When you retain information, it stays in your short-term memory until it is no longer needed, and then it is forgotten. When you learn something, it stays in your long-term memory. You learn that one way to make sure students are learning information and not just retaining it is through rehearsal. There are two kinds of rehearsal: rote rehearsal, or memorizing information exactly as it is presented, word for word, in a certain order, and elaborative rehearsal, or taking the information presented and having students tie it to other concepts they already know. This is a way of making meaning out of information, and this information is much more likely to enter the long-term memory. You learned about primacy recency effect, or the idea that students are more likely to remember the first thing and the last thing they hear during a lesson, and so you should structure your time accordingly. Finally, you learn that because our working memories can only hold a limited amount of information, it's best to group or chunk lots of little pieces of information into one big chunk, so that it is easier for students to learn. Remember the questions that you asked yourself at the beginning of this video. Now is a good time to answer these questions. Once you have done that, apply your answers to the themes of this video.